Okay, so why do you need a high output alternator, or why do you need to worry about keeping your voltage up? Why do some SPL and other car audio folk run high voltage? Well, that's actually, the answer is basically simple, but the intricacies are more complicated. Let me explain. The way you get wattage, which is the power you're putting out to your subwoofer from your amplifier, the way you determine that number that you're going to be able to give your subwoofer is by how much voltage and amperage you're putting into that amplifier. And it's simple math, actually. You multiply the voltage times the amperage to get the wattage. So if you're going to make this amount of wattage, you need this amount of amperage and this amount of voltage. The more voltage you have, the less amperage you need. The less amperage you need, the more efficient your system is. Let's look at some numbers. I have my mathing device. So 800 amps times 12 is 9,600 watts. Okay. Now here's the thing though. Your amplifier takes some of that power it gets and turns it into heat. It doesn't actually kick out all that power. So you're actually going to be multiplying by 10 as far as volts go. If you're dealing with a 12 volt system, you can multiply it times 10. And if we do that, we're going to get 8,000 watts. 800 amps times 10 is 8,000 watts. Now, what if we raise that voltage up? Say, for example, we know we're going to take 2 volts off just to keep the efficiency right. Say we raise it up to 14 volts. Let's try 700 times 14. That's 9,800 watts. Let's try something else. Let's try 600 times 14. That's 8,400 watts. Let's try something else. Let's try 500 times 14. Now we're looking at 7,000 watts. So around 550 amps at 14 volts, well, technically 16 volts, would give you the same amount of wattage as 800 amps at 12 volts. Does that make sense? Those numbers, those volt numbers? So yeah, because of your inefficiencies. 550 amps versus 800 amps. That's a big difference. Now, raising your voltage, as long as your car's electrical system will allow it, will make this work. There is a caveat to this, though. You can't just raise the voltage of the alternator and expect everything to be copacetic, because it's only going to output the power the alternator is capable of. Let's say you've got a 300 amp alternator making 14.5 volts. So it's actually going to give you that 12.5 volt number, because we're knocking it off, you know. The thing is, that 300 amp alternator can't make that 550 amps. So you're still going to be tapping into the batteries, and you're not going to start tapping into the batteries until your voltage drops down to the battery's resting voltage, which means you're back to square one. You may as well not have a high output alternator at all, because it's going to let your voltage fall, because the batteries aren't going to support that alternator at its voltage you're trying to achieve. This is why people are running lithium batteries, because a lot of lithium banks will allow you to run a resting voltage of 15, 16 volts, which means you can charge higher, they will rest higher, and the alternator, while it's trying to put out that 15, 16 volts at that 300 amps, the batteries are already going to be involved because they're resting at that same voltage, and they're going to be helping, which means your voltage is going to be stable, solid. Of course, lithium can be sketchy, so know what you're doing and what you're doing it with. I have several videos on lithium. Can you do the same trick with AGM? Not really, because it rests. It's innate. It's the way the cells are designed. The cells make 2.1 volts. They rest at like 2.1 volts each. 6 of those is high 12s. And the thing is not going to start producing. The battery is not going to start emptying its contents and helping the alternator until it drops below that 12.5 volts, which means it's going to start trying to help at like 12 volts or so. At that point, you're dangerously low, dangerously close to that 11 volt mark. You're dipping down hard. So you've got to get, if you want to run high voltage, which everybody does, you got to make sure your car's system can handle that high voltage. You got to make sure that your storage devices are resting at the voltage that you want to be able to run at. You're going to charge higher than that. So if your batteries are resting at like 14.5 volts, you're going to charge a little higher so that you can charge the batteries. If the alternator is only putting out 14.5 volts and your batteries are resting at 14.5 volts, guess what? They ain't going to get charged until they dip well below that. So you've got to charge a volt or so higher than your batteries rest at in order for them to be able to get fed by the alternator. And you got to bring that voltage. Basically what I'm saying is, whatever voltage your batteries rest at, that's the voltage that the audio system is going to see most of the time. Even though your alternator is key in making this happen, your batteries don't start participating until the voltage comes down. So if you're playing power on your amplifier that's underneath what your alternator is producing, say you've got a 2,000 watt amplifier and a 300 amp alternator, you're making more power with your alternator than your amplifier is consuming. It's going to stay around 14 volts. It's going to stay at whatever voltage that alternator is charging at, and your batteries don't even care what. That's all going right over their head. They're not involved. They're chilling out on the bench over there talking to the hot chick. You're out there playing basketball, you and the alternator, right? They're just chilling. If you want... Yeah, that's me. I'm the one on the bench talking to the hot chick while you're sweating on the basketball court. I'm sorry, I couldn't leave that one alone. Whatever level your bench team is at is what's the real game. Just like a basketball game, actually. You could have 2 or 3 superstars on the team, but if you don't have a deep enough bench, they're going to tire out and you're going to fall apart, halfway through the game. You've got to have a bench that's capable of keeping up. Same concept. If you got to build that bank has to rest at a higher voltage, and whatever that voltage is, that's where your amplifier is going to see, because if you're pulling more power than the alternator is actually putting out, then you've got to have your battery's resting voltage up, or else you're going to be pulling power right at 12 volts. And you're going to be dipping and dipping and dipping. And that's why. So if you want to play the high voltage game, to reiterate, if you want to get your voltage up, that requires eliminating AGM batteries from your system or isolating a starting battery from the rest of it. Either way you want to go, you've got to get them out of that circuit if you want that voltage to run higher. And you're going to have to run storage that rests at the voltage that you want to run. If you want to run 14.5, 15 volts, your batteries need to rest at that voltage. It's just not going to work any other way. So I hope that explained this thing. And I just wanted to communicate properly how this works. Because I've seen a lot of videos where people are kind of, sort of right and kind of not quite right. And, ultimately, you got to do both. You can't do one or the other. You can't put a superstar at a team full of deadbeats and expect the whole team to be amazing. It doesn't really work that way. It is what it is. But I was going to mention that when you run your amplifier at low voltage, you're letting that voltage drop, the further down you go, the more heat and work that amplifier is getting, the more torture it's getting. As that voltage falls, that amplifier is having to conduct a lot more current, which is what's really rough on an amplifier. And that also puts a strain on the rest of the system. So it snowballs. As you're pulling more current, whatever caused your voltage to drop is now getting taxed even more. So it's going to snowball into bad, blown up stereo stuff, possibly damaging equipment in your car. Your voltage is running low enough that can cause damage to other things in the car. Just like the high voltage can.